Hello, and welcome to Torchlit Gaming Podcast. I'm John, your host, and I'm here with Justin, author of Torchlit Gaming, and my co-host for the program. Today, we are pleased to present our inaugural edition of TGP. In each episode, we'll explore our journeys through gaming and strike up a larger discussion about a variety of subjects. You can expect to hear us dive into and debate topics such as gaming in the 90s, the early internet, emulation, anime, and a lot more. We'll share plenty of personal stories and anecdotes, as well as give our takes on hot topics and controversies. We have been united by games for over 25 years, and the games are still here. We're just older now. Justin, it's great to be with you today.
It's great to be with you today, too. What we got going on?
Can you start off by just giving our listeners a little background on Torchlit Gaming and what kind of content we can expect from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So with Torchlit Gaming, I wanted to focus on video games, board games, card games, how it envelops in our culture and how we can really appreciate gaming as a whole. I wanted to go over new games, retro games, things like that. I also wanted to talk about board and card games because, we all grew up playing those and really dig into what makes them so great.
Yeah, I've read several of your blogs, and it's very interesting, especially the one on background music that really caught my attention. So just tell us a little bit about what platforms Torchlit Gaming is available on and where we can read those blog posts.
The majority of the blog posts are going to be on Substack, so you can go to torchliggaming.substack.com and read all the blogs from there. If you would like to support Torchlit, you can apply for a paid subscription, but it's not necessary. We have a free subscription as well, and I post reviews to that and things like that. We are also on Discord. You can join our Discord. I'll have a link on the Substack to get into our Discord where you can talk to us and talk to like-minded readers. We're also on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, and we're going to do Twitch. We're going to have some streams where you can watch me play games and go through my enormous backlog, I hope. And that should be fun. The podcast will be available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We're also looking to expand into YouTube and Facebook, so we'll be there. For all the different things, Torchlit Gaming is the username you can go to, and you'll be able to find us on all those different socials.
Awesome. Yeah, and I just want to give our listeners like a little backstory on me. Now, Justin, you and I, we both went to high school together. Back around 1997, 98, sometime in that, we went to high school in Podunk, Georgia.
Yeah.
So some of the things we did, we borrowed games from each other at school, played Magic the Gathering at the school cafeteria. That was quite the pastime. We watched anime. We had limited resources to do that, but we had Toonami, which we'll talk about that for some of the younger listeners who may not be as familiar, and also, Sci-Fi Network, sometimes on bootlegs from friends. But over time, you're the one who introduced me to Final Fantasy, really kind of showed me the RPG genre. You also introduced me to the E word, emulation. You showed me games were really a lot wider of a world than I previously had conceived of. So yeah, those were some of the golden years to me, about circa 1998. That's when I really discovered that there was this whole wider world, this culture of gaming. Just for our listeners to have a little context, I would say that gaming is a common thread in our friendship, and it was there when we met in school, and it's something that we're still here talking about today. So there's definitely something to be said for that.
And I remember rushing to the lunch table and hanging out and like showing off Dragon Ball Z bootlegs or whatever teachers wouldn't confiscate from us at the time. So that was good times.
Waiting for lunchtime so we could sit at the cafeteria and play Magic cards with our friends, build decks, and share tips on all those things. Yeah, that was 25 years ago, 1999, 27 years ago, if we're talking about as early as 97, which I believe that's when we probably first met.
Yeah.
So really, we're still here. We're still talking about the games. We're just older, but the games are still there, and we're still going to talk about them. Okay, so now that we've kind of got those introductions out of the way, I wanted to really open up discussion today with this question. What got you into gaming? What's your origin story? Tell us a little bit about your roots.
My villain origin. No, I'm just kidding. So When I was a kid, I was probably around 4 years old or so. My dad was really into computers and he was into Star Wars and Star Trek and things like that. And he actually saw those things in theaters. I didn't have that privilege for a while until they, re-released them. But anyway, so he would play things on his Atari. I think he had a 2600, I believe.
The old one.
I know he had ones after the. Yeah, he had a few of them. When he married my mom or whatever, he would always be like, "Hey, let's get this new computer. We can do all sorts of cool stuff with it." And that pass was passed down to me. I do that to this day. But one memory I distinctly remember is I was really into the Mario Brothers show and all that kind of stuff, and I really wanted to get Super Mario Brothers and play all these cool Nintendo games. I really don't remember how I even knew of them, but I do know that when I was 4, at Christmas time, I opened one of my gifts and it was Bubble Bobble, but I had no system to play it. I think my cousin might have had one, so I think they were probably like, "Oh, you can just play it at your cousin." So I was like, "Oh, haha, okay, cool." But then, like behind the tree, they had the actual NES, and I played it from there. And that's one thing that's funny about growing up is a lot of my good core memories are tied to video games. So I think that's why they've always held that place as like a comfort food in a way. Breaking a little bit few years later when the Game Boy came out, I remember distinctly that my dad actually took me to Toys R Us to get a Game Boy, but he tricked me and it was my birthday. But I guess being young, I didn't even think about that. My dad was like, "Hey, why don't you pick? I want to get this gift for your uncle. Why don't you pick out some games you think he would like?" And I was like, "Okay, cool." And so I did that. And then we leave the store. He's like, "Happy birthday, here you go." And I was like, "Man, I would have picked different games if I would have known that." So it's just one of those funny things. And like my dad would play games with me from time to time, and it was a good time. So that was really the genesis, no pun intended, of me getting into games. And then as I grew older, I got a Super Nintendo and I would play Final Fantasy 2, which is 4 now, but whatever. And I would play that over and over and over again and go from there and really get an appreciation for games and how they're made. And I would wait until the credits scene and see who made what game. And then I was like, "Oh, hey, he worked on this game." Even at a young age, I was doing that kind of stuff. So it was just kind of cool. And that's kind of a very brief history at how I got into games and all that sort of stuff. And how about you? How did you get into games? Like, what was your origin story there?
Yeah, well, I can definitely relate to you when it comes to some of my best childhood memories being tied to games. I was mesmerized by my early gaming experiences, and I do remember a lot of them, and most of them happened at other people's homes. I remember being at a family friend's house. I was at a family friend's house. They had an Atari 2600. Obviously, the assortment of games that we had back then was not what it is today. The game I ended up playing was the Smurfs for Atari 2600. It's a very unremarkable game by today's standpoint, and looking back, there's nothing that really stands out. But at that time, the graphics were minimal, but they're good enough. I even went back and looked at it recently, and the graphics are good enough. You can tell a Smurf, it looks like a Smurf, a spider looks like a spider, and so on. But to me, it was exciting, and I just wanted to progress farther. It was a challenging game. Like you can miss time jumping over the little fences, and then your progress is set back. So I just wanted to see what's on the next screen, wanted to go farther. So I remember being really into that game. Also, some of the other early games that I was introduced to at other people's houses were Legend of Zelda NES, Super Mario Brothers, Marble Madness on NES. One of my friends had Snake Rattle and Roll, a little bit lesser known game, but still a solid game on NES. Then later on at other friends' houses, I had a friend who had a PC. Don't know what year that would have been, but we had played Doom, the early one of the early versions of Doom, and also Duke Nukem. So I kind of got that for FPS, that first person shooter experience on early, and eventually I got an SNES. So I didn't grow up with all the consoles or anything. But I eventually, had to ask my parents, "Hey, I really want this? Can I get?" And eventually I got the SNES, and then later I got a Sega Genesis. I even had Tiger Electronics handheld games, and I would play those a lot because that was what I had at the time. I had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on Tiger Electronics, and I had Simon's Quest, Castlevania. And I'm pretty sure I beat those games. And today we laugh about Tiger Electronics, or we see the AVGN spoofs on it. At that time, it was solid. Like that was about that was just what you had to choose from. The assortment was not what it is. Eventually, I got a PS1, and then first I experienced the PS1 at a friend's house, a different friend, and after seeing that, the disc-based era was here, and I eventually was able to, have my own resources, get whatever game systems that I wanted. Of course, emulation was out there. We're not going to go too far into emulation today, but it was available. So if you wanted to try something or kind of get an idea for if you were going to like something, that was out there. But I think overall, we're talking about growing up in the early 90s in my case. So low quality graphics, we kind of had to use our imaginations. We felt that, we experienced that. And the low quality graphics, today to someone who's a younger gamer would feel very limiting. But at that time, it was something that if we had an imagination, we could really capture our attention.
Yeah, 100%.
Yep. And then Justin, you mentioned the Super Mario Brothers show. Was that the live action?
Yeah, with the cartoons intermixed. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Did you learn how to do the Mario?
Yes, I would often do the Mario in my living room and not even be ashamed of it because, it just is what it is. And funny enough, bringing that up, like I have kids and everything now, and I recently showed them that show. I showed them that whole thing, and they thought it was ridiculous, but at the same time, they really enjoyed the dance themselves. So, small wins.
That's good stuff. Justin, I wanted to bring up you've actually held some jobs that are adjacent
Yeah.
to gaming and electronics. Tell us a little bit about some of those jobs that you had.
Oh man, all right. Uh, I want to preface this so you really understand the journey that I went through. So the very first job I ever had was at Brewster's Ice Cream. It was in the Mall of Georgia, so just so you get an idea. I was hired not too long after that to work at Best Buy, and I worked in their media department. So that was like games, CDs, DVDs, etc. So I worked with the games a lot. I'd help people find games. I worked my first Black Friday there. That was pretty fun at the time, and I felt a sense of pride working at a place that I shopped at all the time. I liked that job for a while, and then I got moved around, and I decided to work in the back and see how the sausage is made, so to speak. After a while, I decided to move to Fry's Electronics, which isn't around anymore. So, I could say things about that, but I worked there also in the game and CDs and DVDs department, and I have pretty interesting stories to tell. So, I remember in Best Buy, the very first Black Friday I worked, there was a ton of people, and being my first, I was like, wow, this is crazy. But the craziest thing was not long into my shift, an older guy was like at the TVs and he fell and hit his head on one of those TV stands, and he started just bleeding out like almost
God,
immediately. And everybody's like, oh my gosh. And that was like one of
that's
my
horrible.
first real like retail moments. And luckily he was fine. They were able to get him where he needed to go and whatever. But still, it was shocking. And then at Fry's, I actually kind of moved from CDs, DVDs to the games because they were considered two different departments, but in like under one umbrella kind of thing. I would see. I think I worked there when Halo 2 came out, so that was pretty cool seeing all the stuff happening with that. After that, I worked at Blockbuster, which also isn't around, so that's funny. Two jobs in a row. I worked in the Blockbuster at Podunk, like we. What was it called? I think it was called Game Rush at that time. I think that's what their game department was called. I do recall some funny stories about working there, and now that Blockbuster doesn't exist, I can give you the hot scoop about the seedy underbelly of people that worked at Blockbuster. So I worked there for a while, and then I helped my friend get a job there, and he became a manager. When the Wii came out, right? It was the hot item of that year when the Wii came out. And we got like four of them, and that was it. And of course, it was flying off the shelf because everybody wanted one. Well, my friend and I were like, dude, we should just hold two and tell everybody we just got two. And he's like, yeah, we should do that. We held two in the back, and there's this line of people, and we're not a GameStop, we're not a big real retailer per se. So we were just like, hey, we got two, and everybody's like, oh man, okay, cool. But it was just one of those funny things where it's like it's one of those few times where like I get it, I get how people at GameStop do stuff like this. Not that it's the most ethical thing to do, but at the same time, when you're 19 and you don't really, you're just kind of like, whatever. Speaking against others, there was a time when we would have this thing called Movie Pass where it's basically like an in-store Netflix where you could rent a movie, come back, and then swap it out for another one, and you just pay monthly and you can do that as much as you want. Well, there was this guy and his kid, and he would come in and do that all the time, and everybody thought he was the best customer. He was cool. He just did his thing, and he left. Well, after a while, we started noticing that our artwork for our movies and stuff were disappearing, and we're like, "What the hell? Where are these going?" And my boss set up a camera, and she caught that guy and his kid working in cahoots, and they were cutting the artwork out of the DVDs and just taking the artwork. They didn't care about the movies because what they were doing is they were ripping the movies at home and I guess burning them to a Blu-ray or DVD or whatever, and then putting the artwork from our store in those cases. And my boss was like, either like, hey, either you stop doing this or you're banned. And he's like, yeah, we'll just stop doing this. And that was that. But it was still so funny because it was like a dad and his son enterprising to steal artwork of all things. And what's even funnier is more than likely, if you would have just asked, hey, do you have any of this artwork laying around? We probably would have given it to him because what usually happened is when new releases would stop being new releases, we would get rid of so many copies of it and we just have artwork laying around everywhere. So it's like you didn't have to steal it, dude. It was just
It sounds like they got off pretty easy.
yeah, more or less, you know. And then what's funny is they would after the movie pass, they introduced Game Pass, which is the same idea but for games, and you could swap them out. I think it
No relation to Xbox Game Pass.
right, no relation at all. I think you could do it to where you could have two games out at a time or three games. I don't remember. It's one of those things where you could have so many out at a time and you can swap them. It was a pretty good deal, honestly, if you were from a customer viewpoint, but that was around the time when they got rid of late fees. Like they were like, no more late fees, but they were late fees. They were called restocking fees, and they were essentially the same thing, but they were greatly reduced from what they used to be. But yeah, they still went under not too long after that. I think there's one Blockbuster in like Bend, Oregon or something like that, and that's the only one that exists, which is crazy to me. And in fact, there's not very many movie stores at all anymore. And that's the thing is like,
I wonder how that worked with just one under the name of Blockbuster Video.
yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they're like owned by Blockbuster or if they just have the name or what. I don't know. I'd have to research that and report back.
The 1990s were truly a time unlike any other. Life was simpler then, especially as a kid with limited responsibility. Cell phones were around, but texting was far from a widespread practice. And as a result, we weren't tethered to our phones like we are today. This generally translated to having longer attention spans and greater mental acuity which one could devote to a hobby like playing a video game. Games were not a fragmented, checkpoint-heavy experience that auto-saved your progress every few minutes. They were based instead off of longer levels posing greater challenge. They generally felt more immersive, more fluid, and we were less interrupted by online life as we know it today. We got up in the mornings, went to school, came home, and if we were lucky enough, got to play 8 or 16-bit games on cathode ray tube television sets with our friends. And by the way, if you knew a kid in your neighborhood who had games, you were automatically friends with that kid by default. By the way, how did we even know which games were good? It wasn't from consulting the internet, which was still in the early stages of the dot-com boom. No, if you were lucky, you might have had a dial-up internet connection. Or your parents might have bought you a subscription to Nintendo Power, where you would read glowing reviews of every first-party game release, whether deserving or not. More often than not, you would go to the video store with fingers crossed that all the good games weren't already taken. You'd take a chance on a game solely because the box art looked cool, or if a friend said it was good. Other than that, you had no frame of reference to inform your decision. And what an important decision that was. Chances are you'd be spending your whole weekend with that one game rental, and buyer's remorse would end in tough luck. Now, at the click of a button or tap of a phone or tablet, modern gamers can be spoon-fed all manner of information about any game of their choosing. Hints, tips, reviews, walkthroughs, cheats, story spoilers, and yes, even game demos are all readily available online. Tools any discerning gamer can conjure at will with minimal effort. Aggregate websites such as Metacritic house detailed critiques for us to consume before making a game purchase. We don't even have to leave the comfort of home to acquire new games with the advent of digital media. Gone are the days of game boxes and manuals taking up precious space on our shelving units. Should we so desire, we may simply link our credit cards with the digital storefront, and ownership to virtually any modern game or add-on in existence is magically conferred to us. Now, that's not to say we didn't have sites like GameFAQs.com back in the latter half of the 90s. In fact, we did. And the enlightened ones among us leveraged it as best we could. Make no mistake, GameFAQs was and still is a great forum for robust game discussion. But that fact is massively overshadowed by the plethora of corporate-fueled and sanitized gaming info that gets fed into the internet today. So, what does it all mean, you ask? Well, the fact is, it has never been easier to pick up and play a game than it is today. Question is, are gamers better or worse off for that? You'll hear plenty of debate on that very topic here on our program, so stay tuned.
So I want to talk a little bit about gaming in the 90s, especially from the point of view of being a kid, growing up in the 90s. Talk a little bit about 90s gamer kids and what the challenges were like versus gamers today.
This is such a great question because, as you can tell, I take in a lot of gaming media as a whole, and I've been taking all this media in for, I'm 39 now, so like 35 years I've been gaming and reading up on games and trying to become a developer and trying to be an influencer or whatever. So every generation is going to say my generation's the best for music, gaming, whatever. Every generation is going to say that. But the thing is, for me, I feel like every generation has its pros and cons. For example, back in the 90s, we didn't have an unlimited supply of games like we do today. Like we have Game Pass, we have PlayStation Plus, we have even Nintendo Switch Online, where you can play all those different retro games just spoon fed to you. Like we didn't, and Steam with all their Steam sales, where you can get games for quarters. We didn't have that. I remember growing up, I would get games for birthdays and Christmas, and maybe if there was a sale for it cheap enough, I might get one on clearance every now and then. Like that was it. So I played the same like 10 games over and over. Now I feel like I have choice paralysis, and I think that goes for most media, even movies with Netflix, music with Spotify and Apple Music, everything, even comics, you have like Marvel Unlimited and stuff like that. Like I feel like now it's just constant choice paralysis because you just have so many choices and it's hard to be like, oh, I'm gonna play Dragon Quest 11 today and I'm gonna play this all the way through and beat it. You're way better at it than I am, by the way. I can't sit down and play games for until I beat them. I had to like switch. But anyway, so back in the day, you would play the same 10 games. And on top of that, you didn't have as easy access to walkthroughs and things like that. You had Nintendo Power, you had Electronic Gaming Monthly, you had those magazines, but like you had to go into a physical store to read those magazines and get those hints. You didn't just
Or call the game counselors.
yeah, exactly. Those lasted until like 2005. I thought those ended in the 90s, but they lasted.
I just know that's what I wanted to be when I grew up back then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And what's funny about that is I saw a little thing recently where it was showing them working and like answering calls and like giving out hints. And those games would just be playing Nintendo, like answering calls, like, yeah, oh, Zelda, got you, homie. You gotta make sure you have 12 hearts to get the white sword. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. And it's just like, man, that would be such a dope job to have.
And charging by the minute.
Yeah, exactly. You would just talk really slow. You'd be like, yeah, so, but yes.
Nintendo Power would always have the little fine print, like, please ask your parents before dialing 1-900 so and so.
Yep. Right, exactly. Nobody asked their parents, let's just be honest. You saw a cool game in Nintendo Power. You may have had the resources to rent it. You'd be like, hey, cool, I'm gonna buy this. And you would buy it and then you'd play it and you just keep playing it. Like Final Fantasy 2, that's one of my favorite games of all time because of that, because I knew that game inside and out. And I knew all the secrets to it. I found all the stuff about it. Every single, like every 6 to 8 months, I'd play it again and, get a new appreciation for it. Now, because games are more, I don't want to say single use, but like they're more,
Not as much replay value.
to some degree, yes. But at the same time, it's like, it's that some games, once you beat them, you're done. But I think also there's the problem where you have games that just never end. And so it's hard to really feel like you've mastered something, or it feels like it's not just an enormous time sink. Fortnite's a good example. Like you just keep playing it season after season after season after season after season. And it's like you get FOMO because it's like, oh, they only have this dope Magneto skin for a season, and now you're out shit out of luck. And it's like when I played games back in the day, the games were the games. There wasn't DLC to add on to it. There wasn't patches to fix bugs. Some of the bugs would help you in some cases, and they didn't get patched. And man, I'm sounding like an old man, but like I'm not necessarily saying games now are bad because they're the most graphically intensive games now that we've ever seen. Some of them still blow my mind. Like I can't play newer Mortal Kombat games because they're so gross. Like, ugh. They just drive me nuts because of how graphic and gory they are. But at the same time,
You don't like the X-rays and the
w-
skull crushing?
well,
No.
well, the X-rays are fine. It's when they do the fatalities and you can like see their inner workings, and it's just like in super graphic detail. I'm just like, ugh, it's too much. It's too much, man. It's
Still pushing the envelope all these years later.
But what's funny about that is I grew up in the time before the ESRB and when Mortal Kombat 1 came out, and that was the thing. And like fatalities then were like they created the ESRB because of those fatalities. And those are tame compared to now. Like,
Remember when there was a blood code on Sega and on Super Nintendo they changed the blood into sweat and it was gray instead of red. You remember that?
oh yeah, absolutely. And the disappointment you would feel when you're like, oh right. Oh. But yeah, but then like putting the arrow on the opposite side, gaming today, you have so many choices. You have so many graphically amazing games. You have choices that you wouldn't have had back then. There's been an onslaught of games, not just from Square Enix, but other companies have taken that cue where they've released Japanese games in English that are retro games. Like Trials of Mana is one that, we would have to play through an English patch on emulation, but now they not only did they release it to the US translated, they also made a remake of it in 3D.
I remember playing the DJAP unofficial fan translation. That was the one we played back when I had no other recourse. Well, I mean that game was never localized, so basically our only option was to emulate.
Yeah. And Eon Genesis, the unsung heroes of the English translations. And we would have never got those if it weren't for
A lot
them.
of
And
quality
it's,
titles.
but nowadays, Square saw the dollar signs because they saw how well Romancing Saga 2 but when they released it, and then the collection of Mana did well. And they're like, hey, there's something to releasing these Japanese games in America. We should have done this years ago. And so now it's like they're re-releasing the Romancing Saga 2 as a remake, like a 3D remake like they did with Trials. I wrote about it on the blog. Live Alive, I think is how you pronounce it. They remade that in HD 2D. It's very good. What
Yeah, it's a
else?
great
Like
game.
it's
I think they actually made that game better than the original. The original is a little rough. It's like early SNES. It's still good, but definitely went above and beyond. They have the voice acting's kind of bad, I got to be honest, but they did a really good job overall with that game.
yeah. And that's the other thing, is the HD 2D thing. Like, it's neat that they created that to capture a retro essence, but try to bring it to modern times, like Octopath Traveler and all those. There's so many good things happening in gaming now, same as before. There were a lot of good games that came out in the past that we still play today. Like, people still talk about Super Metroid. People still talk about Final Fantasy 3/6. People still talk about Super
Great game.
Mario World. People still talk about, even like in the PlayStation era.
Basically a who's who of the SNES. Yeah, there's plenty of titles that still hold up today from that
hmm
console.
And that's the thing, is like, I don't want to sit here and make it sound like, oh man, modern games suck. Oh, there are very good games on both sides, and like Bloodborne is one, Bloodstained is one. There's just, I think for me, the key point of when I look back in the past and think about what made gaming good back then, it would be it's really the restriction of choice, honestly, because like nowadays there's just way too much. Or maybe it's just because I'm an adult and I don't have free time where I can't just sit down on a Saturday morning and play until Saturday night and get through half of a game anymore. I don't know. That could be it too, but it's crazy. And there's so many modern things today, like all these retro consoles, like Miu Mini, Retroids, all that stuff to help you recapture that. That's cool too. So I don't know. I don't think there's any one particular answer that's right or wrong, but I think seeing how gaming has evolved over time has been incredibly fascinating, just from the viewpoint of like culture, and how we went from 8-bit graphics 35 years ago to now 4K graphics. And sometimes it's hard to distinguish from reality, and VR. I don't know if you remember VR in its infancy in the mid 90s, where you'd go to like an arcade, Dave and Buster's or something, be like, oh, cool. And now it's like you play it in your house, and it's like a thing now, and you can just play VR and go on VR chat, and it's crazy, dude. It's like literally the future.
Yeah, I think, and there's definitely a lot to be said on this topic, but putting yourself in the shoes of a kid in the 90s, there's a lot of wrinkles to it that you might not think of, especially if you weren't there. But going to a Blockbuster Video or whatever rental store, I mean, I remember renting video games at Ingles Supermarket. But going to whatever rental store, one of your biggest problems was the best games were usually taken, for one thing. They're just not there. I mean, they had a finite number of copies, and from working at Blockbuster and other places that they only have so many copies of Super Metroid, and they only have so many copies of Donkey Kong Country. And if those are gone, then what do you do? Then how do you know which game to pick? Because all you have, and I think sometimes you mentioned the story of the father and son, and the you noticed the artwork was missing. I think sometimes you had artwork. You didn't always have artwork. Sometimes you just had a blank case that said Blockbuster Video logo, and it just said the name of the game. But one of the obstacles was having the game available and not already taken. You had to be lucky enough to get the game right, the top tier games. Another one was knowing which game would be good. And then if you made a wrong decision, you were going to be stuck with Wayne's World for the weekend. And that was the game that or you're going to play Wizard of Oz for the weekend. And you're like, oh, dang, that game kind of sucked. Unless you just had the luxury of having your parents be like, sure, go get 3-4 games. That was not, for me, that was never the case. It was, you get a game. I don't think I rented more than like one game over a weekend. Not that I remember. We consider microtransactions, we consider DLC to be the new normal. That was something that was not present in any of our old consoles. Critics might say that the final product of modern games was incomplete, because if it was a completed product, then why would there be the need to release more DLC afterwards, other than to, cash in? And why, would microtransactions need to be there? Whenever you introduce the microtransactions, it's almost like, well, you're either paying to win, or you're just paying for some kind of cosmetic upgrade, like you mentioned, the Fortnite skins. But yeah, that's kind of my take on the whole 90s versus modern. There was a lot of obstacles in the 90s that we kind of take for granted today.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing, going to the microtransaction thing for a second, there were kind of microtransactions in the 90s in the form of expansion packs, but even then, those were like, those added like 20 to 30 hours. Sometimes they could do that now, like with the Final Fantasy 16 DLC, they add more, and this isn't something that bothers me per se, but I know it bothers others is the idea of not owning the games that you purchase, especially digitally, and how it's a license. Whereas if you own a cartridge of Super Metroid, you own that cartridge kind of thing, which personally I think an all digital future isn't the worst thing in the world if we had some kind of way to combat just losing our games out of nowhere. How, a license expires and then they're like, oh, well, we got to take away these now because we can't sell them. That's the one thing I really don't like about gaming now.
Or if you run out of storage space and you have to delete a game to make room for another game, and then you kind of don't have that game anymore unless you re-download it.
Yeah. And that, yeah. But overall, I think gaming now is good. It's easy to look at gaming in the past with rose tinted glasses and being like, oh, well, my generation was the best because we had Final Fantasy 2 and 3 on the Super Nintendo. So screw all your Final Fantasy 7 remakes. Like it's easy to be close minded that way. But like when you think about it, even beyond the DLC and the microtransactions and all that stuff, there's some cool stuff happening. Like I said, with the English translations coming out officially, that's cool. With there being would there being an appreciation for games overall? When we were growing up, video games were seen as like a nerdy niche thing. People would not want to associate with you if you played video games. If you were into sports, you were cool, but if you're in the video games, you're a loser kind of thing. And I think you've said it before, where if you played video games, you had an automatic connection with another person that had played video games. But now it's more people play video games now than ever before, and it's just an accepted thing. And it's not. You don't have to like hide the fact that you play video games because now there's so much merchandise out there. It blows my mind. Like going back to my example, the Mario Brothers Super Show, like that was like the only show on TV that had anything to do with video games for a very long time. And then you got into like the mid '90s where like the Double Dragon cartoon or like Battletoads or Sam and Max or whatever. That stuff started coming out because gaming was starting to try to really cash in on their mascots. We've had a Mario movie that sold a crazy amount, probably billions of dollars. The Sonic movie is almost on its third movie now. There was a crappy Borderlands movie I heard, even though whatever. I mean, Borderlands is cool, but whatever. Now gaming isn't some thing that you had to be secluded and afraid to play. You can just be you can find like-minded people very easily. Like streamers get paid billions of dollars now to stream to people playing games. Speaking of, check out our Twitch when we play. There's people on like TikTok and YouTube doing video essays and creating crafts and doing backlog challenges. And we talked about speed running, how speed running is a huge thing and they have conventions. So it's like back in the day, it was cool because it's like you have that consistent experience, but now it's cool because you have like a very social experience. Social stuff built into PlayStation and Xbox and Nintendo, some better than others. And you can like play with your friends when before you would have to like go to somebody's house and sit in front of their TV, which we did, and play Bushido Blade or whatever, and then maybe play again in like a week, whatever. But now I can just be like, hey man, you want to play Halo? And we could do that in the snap of a finger. So it's like there's give and take for both sides. There's pros and cons, and it's really hard to like pinpoint exactly which is better because I don't really think either one's better. I think it's just different experiences and different times. And we had it good when we were kids. for our reasons, and kids have it good now. The only thing I would say is like if you were born after 2001, I would say give retro games a second chance because there's some good stuff there. They were made by teams of like less than 50 people half the time. Like a lot of the indie games now are what our games were then. Does that make sense? Like, yeah, that's kind of what it feels like at times.
Yeah, and I don't want any of our listeners to get the wrong idea like that I don't play modern games. I do. I play PS4, PS5, Xbox. I play a little Switch, not quite as much, and it's actually hard for me at some points to go back to retro games even though I really want to. And I feel like I spend a lot of time watching YouTubers who do retro gaming content because it kind of connects me with that 90s setting, but it's a little hard to go back to retro gaming at times when you're used to playing something with the most modern graphics and all the latest and greatest. And another point is that a lot of the classic series that we enjoy are still going strong today, and we still want to see like what's the newest Metroid game going to be like, what's the newest Zelda going to be like. So there's that as well, like for gamers who are in our 30s or even people who are into their 40s, they may still want to see what is the newest Mario game all about and so on and so forth. So yeah, there's definitely pros and cons to both sides, like you said. But Justin, I want to kind of wrap up our conversation today with this question: are the games that we grew up with as good as we remember them, or are we seeing them through nostalgia goggles?
You know, that's a good question. I think in some cases yes, other cases no. And I know I'm being very diplomatic about my answers as of late, but that's one thing about me is I appreciate gaming as a whole from the developer viewpoint, a player viewpoint. I appreciate games, and I know you do too. And it's hard for me sometimes to separate my player mindset and my developer mindset because looking back at the games in the past, as I previously mentioned, they're made by like a small team, with a lot of passion, and they put their heart into it, and they made something wonderful like Chrono Trigger, or Final Fantasy, or da 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 da. Da. And but the thing is, when you really go back and look at it, those experiences didn't happen that often. For every Final Fantasy and for every Chrono Trigger and for every Secret of Mana, we had like a Bubsy or like you said, Cool Spot or
Like Lester the Unlikely?
yeah, there you go. Perfect example. Yeah. And then there were also the teams that were just churning them out for money, just like today. They just churned them out. They were trying to create the next Sonic the Hedgehog, the next Mario. They were trying to do that, but they didn't put but it came from a place of soullessness. And that's the thing that you can kind of see throughout time is when games are made with passion and when games are made for a dollar. You know what I mean? So like for me, I see the nostalgia where some games like Bubsy for me, I have very high nostalgia tied to that game, even though I mentioned it as one that sucks. Like I got it for my birthday one year and I played the hell out of it and I had an appreciation for it in that sense. But overall, it's a shitty game. Let's just be real.
Is that the SNES
Yeah,
Bubsy or the
it's
PlayStation?
the SNES one for sure. And he had the what could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? Then that would be
Gotcha.
like his thing.
Yeah, what could possibly go wrong was actually the PS1 version, but that's another
Yeah, that's
story.
true. That was one of the first 3D games, though, so that's kind of funny. But also, I think what's hilarious going into the mascot aspect of it, like I think it was Accolade, they were really, really hoping to make that the next mascot name brand. Like they made a deal with Taco Bell to like make a cartoon where he would eat Taco Bell in the cartoon because they were hoping it never got aired, but like they were just like hoping to make it a household name. Yeah, that's wild. But yeah, so that as far as nostalgia goes tied to that, like I can think of games that I really liked but may not be seen well today. Like there was a Tiny Toon game. I think it was like Buster Bust Loose, and like that was one that I really wanted, and it was like in the clearance rack. So that tells you everything you need to know. And I love that. In some cases, I may have a little too much love for Chrono Trigger or Final Fantasy or Secret of Mana or Terra Enigma or whatever. Robotrek, Evo, I think was another one. Like, I might see those games in a very rose tinted glasses, even though a lot of people love those games and they think they're awesome too. Compared to games of today, a lot of them are like it's like a night and day difference. It's one of those things. But at the same time, for me, I feel like some pixel graphics stand the test of time. Like Chrono Trigger I keep saying Chrono Trigger, but it's like the best example because it's like everybody loves that game, like new and old gamers alike, because it's just such a timeless story, no pun intended. And the graphics are great because it was near the end of the Super Nintendo's life cycle, so they were able to like squeeze every bit out of it. And that's one of those that will always be there. And I think for me, nostalgia is like the Super Nintendo era. That's for me perfect nostalgia. But even the PlayStation's like 25, almost 25 years old at this point. And like, even the Dreamcast is just had a 20, 25. Yeah, like
25
those
years.
games are, what's the word they use? Not ancient. Retro, but also antiques.
Yeah, to me, PS1 is the last console that I would refer to as a retro console as of right now.
Yeah, and here's gonna blow your mind. Wii is retro at this point.
In my
Does it?
mind, I don't consider
Yeah,
PS2
me either.
or that.
At all.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't consider that generation as retro personally, but I know some people do.
Yeah, it depends on where you landed on that birth line. Because like there's people that when they were 4 and 5, PS2 was out. When they were 4 and 5, PS3 was out. And that just I have a hard time wrapping my head around that because I had a family by the time PlayStation 3 came out. Retro means different things to different people. For me, I'm able to see the retro games for what they are, and I appreciate the ones that are appreciative, but the ones that I can see the ones that are crappy for being crappy, but at the same time, it doesn't change the nostalgia I have for them. As far as they being as good as I remember, I mean, a lot of them, yeah, and the only evidence I have to support this is the fact that we still talk about them today. Final Fantasy, we still talk about it today. There's still more coming out. There's still Mario games coming out. There's still Zelda games coming out, Sonic games, for better or worse. There's still all these things that I grew up with where we were on the first game or the second game, now have like 16 games. In that sense, I think they are as good as I remember. They've just evolved with the times. Other games, not so much. That's why we don't hear of Lester the Unlikely anymore or Jekyll and Hyde, or like Fester's Quest or whatever that was, Adam's Family, those. Yeah. So, what about you? What do you think? Do you think they're as good as you remember?
So for me, if I had to answer in one word, my word is imagination. And if I had to do a second word, my second word would be context. I think you have to have proper context when we look back 30 years or however long into the past. But playing primitive games forced you to use your imagination more. Today we have vibrant graphics that are very eye-catching, and back then my example would be Smurfs again on Atari 2600. This Smurfs game kind of got me into gaming in a way because I found myself sitting there spellbound with the controller in my hand. And I know that is nostalgia at work because it's not like it's a great game or anything, but it's kind of the context of me not owning a console, but really kind of grasping hold of this gaming world that I was learning a little bit about piece by piece. I was learning more about it. On the other hand, a game that is Donkey Kong Country as good as I remember it? Yes, it still is. That was back in 1994. That's one of the Donkey Kong Country is one of the first games that ever had pre-rendered graphics heavily featured in the game. And if you have young kids, you could play Donkey Kong Country with your young kids and it still holds up very well. The gameplay is great. The sound is, I mean, I would be hard pressed to find a better soundtrack. I know a lot of the RPGs on Super Nintendo had great soundtracks, but I would put Donkey Kong Country's soundtrack up against almost any of them. And that wasn't even composed by a Japanese composer, by the way, but I digress. We can definitely talk more about soundtracks in the future. But to me, if you use your imagination, Smurfs could have got you into gaming, and it did for me. But a lot of these games we did grow up with, like the classics, Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario World, Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. Okay, if you look at the games that are on the SNES Classic console, I know it's several years old. I can't remember how many games were released with it, like 20 or something around those lines. They all still hold up today perfectly well, whether it's a racing game or action adventure or RPG, even sports games. I think Mike Tyson's Punch Out is on there, or Super Punch Out for the SNES, but puzzle games like Tetris, all those things do hold up. And there was just that magic somewhere in, I don't know if it was in the development process or if it was in the creative process or if it was in the composing or if it's just a combination, like a perfect storm of all of those things. There are a lot of all-time classics, magical games that are out there that, like you said, if you're born in 2001 or after, then you definitely will be doing yourself a favor by going back and checking out the older catalog, especially 16-bit. I can understand how 8-bit can be a little hard for people to play these days. Some of those games are unforgivingly hard, and I don't even want to sit there and sit through games that have a lot of cheap deaths and things. You know that there was a lot of that on NES. 16-bit for me, and that's kind of when I get nostalgic. And I mean, I definitely grew up playing 8-bit games at other people's houses and all that, but the 16-bit for me really showed the power of those consoles and the sound chips and the increased cartridge sizes. And, I could sit there today. I mentioned that it's a little hard to go back to retro when you've been playing modern games, which I've been playing Spider-Man 2 on PS5 recently when I have some free time, and it's a great game. But going back to those older games, I can still sit there in front of the TV screen and play them for hours on end if I had time to, because they still are captivating in that way. But it's not really one right or wrong answer. There are definitely going to be individual games that we have nostalgia goggles for. Like, I mean, one of them for me would be Dino City, and a lot of people don't know that game, or that might mean nothing. They've made like a whole show. There was a whole TV show, live action. I don't think it was called Dino City, but that's what the game is based on. It's just a fun game. It's two-player game that it just takes me back to being in a friend's living room. And also Mendel Palace. I don't know if you ever played that game for NES. It's a two-player simultaneous game, and I still play that with my brother. When he comes to my house, like, we play Mendel Palace, even though it's like an old obscure game. But those are the nostalgia goggles type of games for me. But then you've got basically any game that's on the SNES Classic is a game that it really is as good as it was as we remember it. It really is still that good, in my opinion.
I would agree. I think one of the funniest things mentioning that is one of my earliest memories of us hanging out is we were talking on the phone and I mentioned James Pond, and that blew your mind that I knew what James Pond was. That actually is what got us talking about this podcast. Is I made the joke about that when I posted about my new site, and that always makes me laugh. Is like, what an obscure game for a couple of people to like bond over, and and going back to Mendel Palace super quick. That was one of Game Freak's first games before Pokemon. I'm not sure if you knew that, but yeah, that was one of their first.
Yeah, sometimes those old two-player simultaneous games, I mean, that's really
Mhm.
fun. Just to have that experience. If you were there, probably have fond memories of it.
Yeah, I think this is before I moved back to Georgia when I was in middle school. I played a lot of Nintendo 64 and I played Bomberman 64 with a friend in Florida, and that's the thing is like it's hard to capture the magic of playing couch co-op with somebody in the same room because like a lot of modern games don't do that anymore. They expect you to play online. Some do, but it's just one of those things when you just have a bunch of people in the same room yelling at each other and you can't match that in a lot of ways. But
Yeah, you can playing Super Smash Brothers for Nintendo 64 with three other buddies. Everybody's got a controller, and that's something you just can't replicate any other way.
yeah. I mean, you could try, but it's not the same. But yeah, I agree. That's funny.
So, Justin, what's the easiest way for new listeners to hear our latest podcast? How can they subscribe or rate or review our content?
Right now, the best way to do it is to go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and look up Torchlit Gaming, and we should be there. And you can review, you can hear new and old episodes, you can subscribe, you can hear our lovely voices, and go from there. And we're gonna keep on trucking and talk about. I think we're still plotting it out, but I think we might go into emulation or anime. And that's the other thing is going back to what the show is about. I think what'll be nice is talking about game adjacent stuff because anime was big in the gaming circles. The Simpsons, emulation. There's all sorts of stuff to talk about when it comes to gaming as a cultural phenomenon, so to speak. So
Absolutely. And finally, what's the easiest way for listeners to interact with you when it comes to ideas or suggestions or feedback?
you can hit up our Substack. It'll be torchlightgaming.substack.com, or you could go to Threads, Torchlight Gaming on Threads, or TikTok. You can go on TikTok. Torchlight Gaming is on there, and of course, we'll be streaming on Twitch. It's going to be sporadic, but I want to play some games on there, some Final Fantasies, some quicker games, and feel free to join the chat and speak your mind, and we'll go from there.
All right. Great conversation, and we will see you next time.
Yep. See you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, folks. Hey, we've got some great episodes planned for the future. This was only scratching the surface today. Be patient as we both work around our busy schedules to get more of this content out to you. We do hope you'll join us next time for another exciting episode of TGP. Later.